Catherine's hands trembled as she stood before the microphone in the bustling JFK terminal, her pilot uniform crisp against the chaos of travelers rushing past. "My name is Captain Catherine Hayes, and today I want to introduce my wife, Kendall," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. 30 seconds later, the airline supervisor stormed in, face flushed with anger, declaring her grounded indefinitely for violating the company's moral standards clause. The words hung in the air like a verdict, and the small crowd of reporters and crew froze. Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her, but she refused to look away from Kendall, who stood just a few feet behind her with quiet strength in her eyes. Security escorted her to a side office before she could even process what had happened. The door clicked shut, sealing her inside with the supervisor, Mr. Harlan, a man she had flown with for years and respected as a mentor. "What were you thinking, Catherine?" he asked, his voice low but edged with disappointment. "This airline has built its reputation on traditional family values. Passengers expect pilots who represent stability. Not this." He gestured vaguely toward the door where Kendall waited outside. Catherine sat down slowly, her mind racing through the years of careful silence she had maintained. She had always been the reliable one, the captain who never missed a flight, who prayed quietly before every takeoff because her faith mattered to her even if she no longer attended the family church back in Ohio. But hiding Kendall had started to feel like a betrayal of everything she believed in about honesty and love. Outside the office, Kendall paced the hallway, her dark hair pulled into a simple ponytail, wearing the same modest blouse she had chosen that morning to look professional beside her wife. She had begged Catherine not to do this publicly, not today, not at the airline's annual safety press event. Yet here they were. Kendall's phone buzzed with messages from her own family, supportive texts mixed with worried ones reminding her how conservative their small town still was. She understood the risk better than anyone. She had watched Catherine wrestle with guilt for months, praying alone in hotel rooms after long hauls, asking God if loving another woman made her unworthy of the sky she had worked so hard to conquer. The internal storm had finally broken when Kendall said, "I can't keep being your secret. It's killing us both." Now the consequences were unfolding faster than either had imagined. Mr. Harlan slid a folder across the desk. "Policy is clear. We have to protect the brand. You're suspended pending review." Catherine stared at the paper but didn't reach for it. She thought of her father, Reverend Hayes, who had raised her on Bible verses about marriage being between man and woman. He had stopped speaking to her the day she first whispered Kendall's name over the phone 2 years ago. Her mother still sent birthday cards with careful, neutral wording. The weight of their silence had pressed on her every time she strapped into the cockpit, wondering if God really saw her love as sin or if the real sin was living a lie. "I've given this airline 15 years of flawless service," she said quietly. "Does that count for nothing against who I love?" Harlan sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not personal, Catherine. It's business. And faith. The board won't budge on this." The conversation stretched on, circling the same painful points. Duty versus identity, tradition versus truth. Neither raised their voice, yet the tension thickened until breathing felt difficult. Catherine's mind drifted to the first time she met Kendall at a quiet coffee shop near LaGuardia during a layover. Kendall had been grading papers, a high school history teacher with a gentle laugh that cut through Catherine's exhaustion. Their friendship had grown slowly, safely hidden from colleagues and family. But safety had become suffocating. When Kendall finally said yes to marriage in a small private ceremony in Vermont, Catherine had cried in the car afterward, torn between joy and the fear that she was disappointing everyone who had ever believed in her. Now that fear had materialized in this sterile office. By the time security returned to escort her out of the terminal, Catherine's legs felt heavy. Kendall slipped her hand into hers right there in the corridor, a small act of defiance that drew stares from passing crew members. Some looked away awkwardly. Others whispered. Catherine squeezed back, drawing strength from the warmth she had fought so long to keep private. As they walked toward the exit, she wondered how many pilots she had trained were now questioning everything they thought they knew about her. The airport buzzed around them, unchanged, flights departing, announcements echoing. Yet her entire world had narrowed to this single moment of exposure. 30 minutes had not yet passed when the supervisor's phone rang again. Catherine and Kendall were still standing near the employee exit, waiting for the official paperwork, when Harlan burst out of his office looking as though he had seen a ghost. "Hold on," he called, voice tight. "The legal department just got off the phone with the union. Social media is exploding. We need to talk." Catherine turned slowly, her pilot cap still clutched in her hand like a shield. Kendall's grip tightened on her arm, but neither spoke. The reversal came faster than any of them expected, yet it did not feel like victory. It felt like the beginning of something far more complicated. Inside the same office, now crowded with 3 more executives and a union rep who had rushed over from the other terminal, the atmosphere crackled with urgency. "The video is everywhere," the union rep said, sliding his tablet across the desk. Catherine's announcement played on loop, her steady voice, Kendall's proud smile, the supervisor's abrupt interruption. Comments flooded in. Passengers threatening to switch airlines, fellow pilots posting support, religious groups calling for boycotts. "We can't afford the optics of a discrimination lawsuit right now," the head of HR admitted, avoiding Catherine's eyes. "The board is convening an emergency call. Suspension is lifted effective immediately." Harlan looked physically ill. "This doesn't change policy," he muttered. "It just pauses it." Catherine listened without triumph. She had expected relief, maybe even gratitude, but instead a hollow ache settled in her chest. She thought of the passengers who trusted her with their lives every day. Would they still feel safe knowing their captain was married to a woman? The question had haunted her since the first time she hid Kendall's photo in her flight bag. Her faith, once a source of comfort before every takeoff, now felt like a rope pulled in 2 directions. She still believed in God. She still whispered the same prayers. But she could no longer reconcile the verses her father quoted with the love that made her feel most alive. "I appreciate the reversal," she said carefully, "but I need to know if this is permanent or just damage control." The room fell silent. No one had an easy answer. Kendall spoke for the first time since entering the office. "Catherine has risked everything for this career. She's saved lives at 30,000 feet. Her personal life doesn't change that." Her voice was calm, measured, the same tone she used in her classroom when students challenged historical truths. The executives shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a woman in her 50s who had always been friendly on layovers, finally met Catherine's gaze. "We're not saying it does. But some of our biggest clients come from communities that still hold very traditional views. We have to balance everyone." The words echoed the same arguments Catherine had heard from her own family for years. Her brother had once told her, "Love is love, but don't make the rest of us choose sides." She had chosen anyway. As the meeting dragged on with talk of revised policies and sensitivity training, Catherine's mind wandered back to the night she had proposed to Kendall. They had been parked on a quiet hill overlooking the runway lights at their home airport in Chicago. Kendall had said yes through tears, but then asked the question that still kept Catherine awake some nights. "Are you sure you can live with what this will cost you?" At the time, Catherine had answered with confidence. Now, watching grown men in suits debate her right to exist openly, that confidence felt fragile. She excused herself briefly to step into the hallway and call her mother. The phone rang 4 times before voicemail picked up. The silence hurt more than any outright rejection. When she returned, the union rep was already drafting a statement. "We'll announce that Captain Hayes is back on the schedule starting tomorrow. No further comment on personal matters." Catherine nodded, but the victory tasted bittersweet. She had won the immediate battle, yet the war inside her, between the pilot who lived for the sky and the woman who refused to hide anymore, had only just begun. Kendall touched her shoulder gently, grounding her. Outside the window, planes taxied and lifted off, oblivious to the quiet revolution happening on the ground. The next morning Catherine reported for duty as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Crew members who had once joked with her now offered careful, polite nods. In the briefing room, the first officer, a young man named Marcus she had mentored, hesitated before taking his seat beside her. "Captain, I just want you to know I respect you. Always have." His words were sincere, yet the careful distance in his tone stung. Catherine smiled anyway and began the standard pre-flight checklist. The cockpit felt smaller than usual. The familiar routine suddenly weighted with the knowledge that her private life was now public property. During the long haul to Los Angeles, turbulence forced her focus back to the controls, but the quiet moments between radio calls allowed doubt to creep in. She remembered the heated conversation with her father 3 nights earlier, after the video had reached their small Ohio town. "You're throwing away everything we taught you," he had said, voice cracking with disappointment rather than anger. "God has a plan for marriage, Catherine. This isn't it." She had tried to explain that her faith had only grown stronger since meeting Kendall, that love had taught her more about grace than any sermon. He had simply replied, "Grace doesn't mean rewriting scripture." The call had ended with both of them in tears and no resolution. Kendall waited at the hotel in Los Angeles with takeout Thai food, and a quiet understanding that no words were needed yet. They ate on the balcony overlooking the city lights, the same way they had done dozens of times before the announcement. But tonight Kendall asked the question they had both been avoiding. "Do you regret it?" Catherine set her fork down and looked at the woman who had become her home. "I regret hurting people I love, but I don't regret being honest with the world about you." Kendall reached across the small table and took her hand. In that simple touch, Catherine felt the tension of the day begin to ease. Yet she knew the real test was still coming. When they returned home and faced the family dinner her mother had insisted on scheduling despite everything. Back in New York 2 days later, the dinner unfolded exactly as Catherine had feared. Her parents sat at one end of the table, Kendall at the other, with Catherine caught in the middle. Her mother had prepared Catherine's favorite pot roast, a silent olive branch. Conversation stayed carefully neutral until her father cleared his throat. "The church is praying for you both," he said. The word both carried layers of meaning Catherine understood too well. Kendall responded with grace, sharing stories from her classroom about students who struggled with identity. For a moment the room felt almost normal. Then her brother arrived late, took one look at Kendall's hand resting near Catherine's, and the temperature dropped. "I just don't understand why you had to make it public," he muttered. "Some things are better kept private." The argument that followed was not loud but devastating in its quiet intensity. Each person spoke from a place of genuine conviction. Her father from decades of pastoral care, her brother from fear of social ostracism in their tight-knit community, Catherine from years of silent longing. No one raised their voice, yet every sentence landed like a stone in still water. Kendall sat quietly, absorbing the pain without flinching, occasionally squeezing Catherine's knee under the table. When the evening ended with polite goodbyes and no hugs, Catherine stood on the porch watching her family drive away, and felt something inside her crack open. She had gained the right to hold her wife's hand in public, but she had lost the easy warmth of belonging that had once defined her life. That night in bed, Kendall whispered, "We don't have to fix everything tonight." Catherine turned toward her, tracing the familiar curve of her cheek in the dark. "I know. But I'm starting to realize that choosing us might mean choosing a different kind of family." The words felt both freeing and terrifying. Outside, rain began to fall against the window, mirroring the storm still raging inside her. Weeks passed, and the initial media frenzy quieted into a steady undercurrent of support and criticism. Catherine flew her routes with the same precision that had earned her the nickname Ice Queen among younger pilots, but privately she began keeping a journal, something she had never done before. Page after page filled with prayers that no longer sounded like the ones she had learned as a child. "Help me understand where you stand on this," she wrote one night after a particularly rough landing in Chicago, "because I still feel your presence every time I break through the clouds, but I also feel it when Kendall smiles at me across the dinner table." The act of writing became its own form of worship, messy and honest. At the airline, small changes appeared. A new diversity training session was added to the calendar, and several colleagues who had stayed silent now sought her out during layovers to share their own stories, some of hidden identities, others of evolving beliefs. Marcus, the first officer, admitted over coffee in Denver that his church had started a study group on inclusion after watching her video. "You made people uncomfortable in the best way," he said. Catherine laughed softly, but the praise felt heavy. She had never wanted to be anyone's symbol. She had simply wanted to stop lying. Kendall's world shifted too. Parents at her high school began requesting different teachers for their children, citing moral concerns. The principal called her in for a meeting that felt eerily similar to Catherine's airport confrontation. "We support you personally," he said, echoing the same careful language Catherine had heard from executives. But we have to consider the community. Kendall came home that evening quieter than usual. Over dinner she finally spoke. I thought standing beside you would be the hardest part. Turns out watching you carry everyone else's discomfort is harder. Catherine reached for her hand across the table, the same gesture that had started everything. For the first time, she wondered if her courage had cost Kendall more than she had anticipated. The turning point arrived during a family wedding back in Ohio. Catherine had debated attending for weeks, but Kendall insisted they go together. They need to see us as a normal couple, not a headline. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Her cousin marrying her high school sweetheart in the same church where Catherine had been baptized. During the reception, however, an elderly aunt approached their table with a Bible in her hand. I love you, dear, she said to Catherine, but I worry your soul is in danger. The words were spoken with genuine tears, not malice. Catherine listened, then replied softly, Aunt Ruth, I've never felt closer to God than when I'm living truthfully. The conversation ended without resolution, yet something shifted in the room. Several younger cousins later pulled Catherine aside to thank her for being brave. The contrast between generations left her dizzy with conflicting emotions. On the drive back to the airport hotel, Kendall rested her head on Catherine's shoulder. You handled that with more grace than I could have. Catherine smiled into the darkness. I'm learning that grace works both ways, toward them and toward myself. The realization settled deep, a quiet anchor amid the ongoing storm. She still did not have answers that would satisfy her father or the airline board. But she was beginning to accept that maybe the answers were not the point. The point was continuing to choose love even when it hurt. High above the Atlantic on a red-eye to London, Catherine finally allowed herself to cry in the cockpit, silent tears that Marcus pretended not to notice. The latest message from her mother had arrived just before takeoff. Your father is struggling. The church elders want him to step down because of the video. We're praying for healing. The words looped in her mind between radio calls. She had caused pain she could never undo, yet undoing her truth felt impossible. When they landed at Heathrow, she found a quiet corner in the crew lounge and called Kendall. I keep thinking maybe I should have waited, she confessed. Kendall's voice came through steady and warm. Waiting almost destroyed us once. Remember the year we barely saw each other because you were terrified someone would find out? Catherine did remember. The sleepless nights, the forced smiles, the way love had started to feel like a burden instead of a gift. Back home, the internal conflict reached its peak during a mandatory meeting with the airline's ethics committee. Executives, union leaders, and even a chaplain sat around a polished table while Catherine recounted her journey. The chaplain, a kind woman in her 60s, asked the question everyone had been circling. Do you still consider yourself a person of faith, Captain? Catherine answered without hesitation. More than ever. Faith isn't about fitting into someone else's box. It's about trusting God with the person He actually made me to be. The room absorbed her words in heavy silence. No one argued. Instead, the committee recommended a revised policy that allowed personal disclosures without penalty. The decision felt like justice, yet Catherine left the building carrying a deeper sadness. She had won the right to exist openly, but the cost was measured in fractured relationships and quiet estrangements. That evening Kendall surprised her with tickets to a small theater production about love across divides. During the intermission, they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the same skyline they had watched on their first official date after moving in together. I'm proud of you, Kendall said, resting her head against Catherine's shoulder. Not because you won at the airline, but because you're learning to live with the losses. Catherine turned and kissed her forehead, a gentle gesture free of any need to hide. In that moment, the weight she had carried for months lightened just enough to breathe. She realized the awakening was not about triumph but about making peace with the pieces she could not put back together. The following Sunday, Catherine did something she had not done in years. She attended church alone while Kendall stayed home grading papers. She sat in the back row of a small progressive congregation near their apartment, listening to a sermon on radical love that made no demands for conformity. Tears slipped down her cheeks during the closing hymn. For the first time, faith and identity felt like they could coexist without constant war inside her. She still did not know how to bridge the gap with her family, but she no longer felt she had to abandon one to keep the other. Months later, Catherine stood in the same JFK terminal where everything had begun, this time preparing for a routine flight to Seattle. Kendall waited near security, holding 2 coffees and wearing the same quiet smile that had first captured Catherine's heart. The airport moved around them with its usual rhythm. Announcements, rolling suitcases, families saying goodbye. No cameras, no executives, just 2 women who had survived the storm together. Catherine took the coffee and kissed Kendall lightly on the cheek, right there in public because she could. The simple act still carried a small thrill of freedom. Yet as she walked toward the gate, Catherine carried the knowledge that freedom had come at a price. Her father still sent monthly emails filled with scripture but no personal updates. Her mother called on holidays, voice warm yet careful. The family she had grown up with had not disappeared, but the easy belonging was gone. She had accepted that some losses were permanent. The responsibility she now felt was not guilt but stewardship, of her marriage, her career, and the quiet example she set for younger pilots who watched her every move. She no longer prayed for God to change her. She prayed for the strength to keep choosing honesty even when it hurt. Boarding the plane, she performed the pre-flight checks with the same meticulous care that had defined her career. In the cockpit, Marcus gave her a thumbs up from the right seat. "Ready when you are, Captain." Catherine smiled and reached for the radio. As the engines hummed to life, she glanced once more toward the terminal where Kendall stood waving. The sky waited vast and unchanged, offering the same peace it always had. But Catherine herself had changed. She understood now that the greatest courage was not announcing her truth to the world. It was living with everything that announcement had set in motion. The plane lifted off into clear blue. And for the first time in months, Catherine felt truly at home in both her cockpit and her heart. She had lost pieces of her old life, but she had gained something deeper. The quiet certainty that she was exactly who she was meant to be. True or false? Catherine's decision to reveal her wife publicly was the right choice even though it caused lasting pain to her family and nearly cost her career.